Hi, everyone. This is Mason Richey again from Hanguk University of Foreign Studies and the Asia Society. And we are happy to have you here today for another one of our monthly roundtables. This time we're going to be commemorating, if you will, a very unhappy event in many respects historically, namely the beginning of the Korean War 70 years ago. We're actually recording a few days ahead of time. The actual date for the beginning of the war was June 25th, 1950. And we'll be hitting, therefore, the 70th anniversary of the beginning of that war. I note also that June is an interesting month in Korea. There are actually a number of anniversaries, some of which happier than others, I guess. In addition to that, beginning of the Korean War, we also have the June struggle, which took place in 1987 and led by December to the first democratically held presidential elections here. We also have the June 15th joint declaration between North Korea and South Korea, the anniversary of which happened just a few days ago, the 20th anniversary. And of course, on June 12th, 2018, we had the Singapore summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. So June's a very portentous month in Korea. So we're happy to be able to get together and have a discussion about some of these events. As I said, the main focus is going to be the Korean War, but I'm fairly sure that we'll be able to get to some of the other historical events as well. In many respects, they're connected and grow out, of course, of the Korean War, so that's not totally out of place topically. I also note that we're doing this one day after North Korea decided to demolish the Inter-Korean Liaison Office at Kaesong, which was a very concrete, literally symbol of some at least aspirational inter-Korean cooperation towards reducing the tension that lingers and in many respects began with the Korean War, which started 70 years ago today, or 70 years ago this month. So with that context, let me go ahead and introduce our three outstanding guests that we have today. This is perhaps our strongest group of scholars, which is not to say that our other groups of scholars haven't been excellent as well. To begin with, I'm going to introduce Oriana Mastro Skylar, who's a professor at Georgetown University for the moment. She will soon be decamping to the Freeman Spogli Center at Stanford, where she will continue her research on international security, war termination, coercive diplomacy, and other areas of research that are especially useful, of course, for understanding the international political dynamics in Northeast Asia. Secondly, we have John Delury, professor at Yonsei University here, who along with Orville Schell, wrote Wealth and Power, China's Long March to the 21st Century. And thirdly, we have Kim Young-jun, who is a professor at the Korean National Defense University, and who wrote an absolutely fabulous book on the origins of North Korea as a garrison state. I note also that he is a member of the President's Advisory Board on National Security, and himself a former member of the military here in Korea. I won't go through the bios of each of these three outstanding guests. I will simply say, first of all, I'm honored that they would deign to join me. And if you want to know more about their research and the work that they do, I would encourage everyone to take a long look at the bios that are on the Asia Society webpage, where their long list of fabulous accomplishments are listed. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and move directly into the questions. And I think I'm going to start with John. After that, you know, if Oriana or Young-jun want to jump in on this question, you're welcome to. And then after that, we'll kind of see where things lead. But John, I'm going to start with this. You're a historian, so maybe this is a good place for you to start. You know, why and how did the Korean War start?
Well, Mason, first of all, good morning. again, and thanks for having me on this call. This is indeed a wonderful group to be a part of, and I'm always happy to do anything with Asia Society. But thanks for putting this together. You know, that's in a funny way, you'd think that would be a simple question and solved by now. It's been 70 years. You'd like to think that the historians have combed through all the documents and that we know the answer. We definitely want to hear from Young-jun because he's done a lot of work on that critical period, really before the Korean War, because the answers to why it happened have to be found prior to the outbreak. But one thing I would just say from the start is actually there's a lot we don't know, and we often forget that we don't know. We've gotten a lot of documentation from various archives, you know, and the Wilson Center has done an incredible job. And so there's been rewriting of the sources of the Korean War. And we do know from the diplomatic correspondence from the Chinese and the Soviet side that, to answer your question, at the end of the day, Kim Il-sung wanted to invade South Korea. He wanted to, you know, the idea of South Korea barely existed. North Korea barely existed. Both leaders of both Koreas believed there was one Korea. You know, metaphysically for them, there was one Korea. For us now, we think of two Koreas, but neither side really accepted that proposition back then. It was a very weak proposition. So it was a war of unification, and unification was the top goal, both in Seoul and Pyongyang. In a way, Kim Il-sung went first. He went very hard, and he nearly succeeded. The reason I just add the caveat of what we don't know is for this question and everything subsequent to it, we don't have access to North Korean archives. And so we always get a distorted picture because we get what the North Koreans are telling the Soviets, what they're telling the Chinese, what all the Eastern Europeans are snooping in and hearing, but we never really know what they're telling themselves. And it's important to keep that in mind.
That's great. Young-jun or Oriana, do either of you have anything you want to add to that? Young-jun, please.
Now, Oriana first. She said something. Yeah.
You're muted, Oriana. Hold on one second.
Sorry.
There
you go. Sorry. So I was just going to pop in and say I worked on a book called The Cost of Conversation, Obstacles to Peace Talks and War. And in that book, I was able to go into the Chinese archives because one of my case studies is Chinese decision-making in the Korean War. And John kind of alluded to this, but there's some interesting parts of this history. The first is, till very recently, the Chinese Communist Party position was that it's unknowable how the war started. It was actually only a couple of years ago that they publicly admitted that North Korea attacked South Korea. So that also just gives you a sense of how political this issue really is. The fact that even in China, history is kind of being manipulated and things are being hidden to say this wasn't North Korea's fault. And it absolutely was an important role for China. In my view, I'm not a historian, but looking through those archives, and it seems that if Mao wasn't trying to improve his relationship with the Soviet Union, then, you know, and the Soviet Union wasn't trying to compete for influence in Asia, and they didn't provide North Korea with the support to invade, then perhaps that war never would have happened. So I think the role of external actors is also critical.
Great, thanks. Young-jun, it seemed like you had something you wanted to say as well.
Yeah, I agree with John and Oriana. Yes, the overall picture is absolutely true. And Woodrow Wilson Center has now a lot of international Cold War sources, including Russian, Chinese, and North Korean even. I dig in the North Korean archives in Maryland College Park because the UN forces, when they occupy Pyongyang, they have millions of documents, paper sent to the Washington D.C. and I just found some just a 1 or 2% part of the millions of documents, North Korean documents, especially from 1945 to 1951. So I found it very interesting. This is another issue is a civil factor is very strong as well as the international factor. As you guys already know, Truman is different from FDR. He is a conservative figure inside the Democratic Party. He wanted to do something because he lost to China in 1949. and Stalin want to manipulate the Korean War for his interest rather than the North Korean or Chinese interest. He actually used Kim Il-sung and Mao for Soviet Union interests. And South Korea and North Korea has a lot of problems, especially still today problem. Pro-Japanese collaboration is the issue, and also land reform issue as well, because of the post-1948 and post-1945 has a lot of the civil problem inside of the Korean Peninsula. So I think I agree with the Bruce Cummings to point out the this is actually a civil war, but at the same time, I love the William Stuck point out this this is an internationalized civil war. So I think it's also factor, especially strongly influential the origin of the Korean War as well.
Great, thanks. I'll just pick up, I think at some point in my head, I thought when I was introducing this topic, I would throw somehow this term, the forgotten war, into this. And as John was discussing, how in some ways we've, forgotten certain things that we don't know. In fact, it sort of jogged my memory that this is, in some sense considered the forgotten war. But I think something I'm getting, from each of you in some way is that, not only is this the forgotten war in the sense that it's the one that tends to be overlooked by, the great, the two great wars, or, the debacle of Vietnam, which was mediatized differently afterwards. It's also a war that in some sense is misunderstood, and perhaps, has always been misunderstood. And I think it's great that, both Oriana and Young-jun and John as well have referred to how it is that historians still have a role to play in digging deeper, whether that be into Chinese archives, or the archives that may be in Maryland at University Park, and hopefully at some point in the future, maybe we'll have some access to some of these archives in North Korea. But within that sort of larger framework of the fact that the war might still be relatively misunderstood, I'll ask, I guess, sort of two related questions, I guess. The first of which is, what perhaps is misunderstood about the war? What specific things perhaps do we not get that are critical questions that need to be answered in order to understand more about it? And then going again to the question of perhaps North Korea's intentions, again, since John brought this up with reference to the fact that North Korea invaded the South, what did Kim Il-sung want to accomplish with this invasion? And I'll throw that out there to any of the three of you.
I don't always want to be the one to start, but I'll go ahead and say a few words about China, since that's mainly my area of expertise, is this from the China perspective. I think, there are many things that we misunderstood at the time that I think foreshadow, to bring it back to current events, tells us that we should not have so much hubris about what we understand now when it comes to these very complex dynamics between North Korea, South Korea, China, the United States, Russia, all these different actors. The Korean War, while it seems like it's not something we discuss a lot, in my view, it was such an important and unique war because it determined in many ways the regional order. It delayed China's modernization, right? Mao Zedong even was willing to fight a war against the most technologically advanced power, a year after the People's Republic of China was founded, and it had very significant domestic implications. So their willingness to take risks and use force, I think, was pretty extraordinary. And because they took that risk, because the Soviet Union promised them support in the war, including air support, which the Soviet Union never delivered, it's possible that hastened the Sino-Soviet split. And without the Sino-Soviet split, you don't have U.S. normalization of relations and the United States and China siding against the Soviet Union. And then maybe you don't have the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? So I think actually this war, very much shaped the Cold War and in reality, the post-Cold War world. And so now we look at some of these dynamics, and again, the United States and China are focused very much on the bilateral relationship. But what we have to understand is what happens in the Korean Peninsula could be, just like it was the determining factor for the regional order 70 years ago, it could be the determining factor of the regional order in the future. We have all sorts of ideas about the competition between China and the United States, but if there's a conflict on the peninsula, that's going to change the balance of power. That's going to change both countries' priorities, and that's going to change the future of Asia and the world. So I think this is something that is not very understood, is really the lasting impact that this has had, not only and obviously on the Korean Peninsula, but in the region and on U.S. security.
Yeah, Mason, maybe I'll jump in, just pick up on some of these threads. I mean, I've thought a lot about this this label of forgotten war. From what I know, that term, obviously they couldn't have called it the Forgotten War immediately. The first book I'm aware of, I think it's a book that was published, I think in the late 60s. So at the time, and there's actually a little literature around the Vietnam War that does look back to Korea. I think more than we realize. Americans at least were aware of the Korean War legacy as they were sinking deeper and deeper into the Vietnam War quagmire, especially in the late 1960s. And so it was actually partly triggered by Vietnam that this notion of Korea was labeled as a forgotten war, in the sense of we should remember Korea and the lessons of Korea. And they really weren't learned, and many of the same mistakes were repeated in Vietnam that have been made in Korea. So I think it's also important to remember Forgotten War is a very American label for it. It wasn't forgotten ever. It was, if it was under-remembered in the United States, it was hyper over-remembered, and is to this day in North Korea. So that's very important to keep in mind, that there's a profound asymmetry in the public memory of this event in North Korea versus really everywhere else, but especially North Korea and the United States. That often causes problems to this day. It was, the best scholar I know is a friend of ours, Jiao Ma, at the University of, or Washington University, who's should be having a book coming out on this. He's done very interesting stuff on the history within China of remembering the war and the public memory. And so he's traced a real, it's not a simple story, but there was a lot of remembering the war immediately, because the PRC, somewhat contrary to Oriana's analysis, Mao saw it as a victory and heralded it as a victory, you know, and in a way fighting the United States back to the starting line. That was a defeat for Kim Il-sung, but that was a pretty big victory for Mao Zedong. And they certainly made a lot of a mileage out of it, of here we have stood up to imperialism. And so it was not the forgotten war in China. And the last point I would make is the legacy of the war, the way it's remembered, under-remembered, over-remembered, misremembered, I think has been complicated, because one thing I've seen in the US is I'm not sure we can really call it the forgotten war anymore. It's not like people in America wake up thinking about the Korean War. But it's kind of on the same level, at least, of not the public impact of Vietnam, but say in the Obama administration, there was a big effort to remember it. And specifically, it was relabeled. I think President Obama gave a speech at a ceremony opening a new Korean War memorial, where he relabeled it the Forgotten Victory. And this is kind of a narrative that I think, as a historian, we should be very skeptical of. It's a teleological misremembering of the Korean War, where all the subsequent successes of South Korea, which come much later, the economic successes of the later 60s and 1970s, and then forward, but especially the political breakthrough of a successful democracy movement, which is not until the 1980s and even into the 90s. All of that is projected back onto the Korean War. And Americans take credit. We defended South Korea, this capitalist liberal democracy, this tiger economy. You know, we did that, and that's the forgotten victory. And then you get the picture of no lights on in North Korea and all the lights bright in South Korea. And while it's not entirely contrived, it's a radically oversimplified and historically unrevealing version of events. And I think it's important that we see that, you know, that we don't fall for these simplistic narratives. That in a way, I would pick up on Oriana's term. There's a kind of hubris, you know, which is typical of American foreign policy, to claim all of these credits and project them back onto relabeling this war, which there's no question it was a defeat for the United States overall, is now relabeled a forgotten victory.
Great, thanks. Young-jun, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, especially the misconception of the Korean War. I just published just yesterday, the Wilson Center published the Wilson Quarterly, special issue for the 7 years Korean War University. I was one of the author with the Beijing University Professor Kim Dong-gil and Stilwell and Greg Brzezinski, the other guy who wrote why we need to study still Korean War. Because the Korean War still have a very influential, especially to North Korean and South Korean and some other international community. For example, we have to know about the North Korea-China relation. This is a kind of myth on the blood alliance. This was never. Because, for example, Kim Il-sung at the time is very fear about the pro-Chinese North Korean military rise because of China help North Korea. So at the time, Kim Il-sung purged some of the pro-Chinese North Korean military guy of the KPA. So he created a kind of a political commissary inside of the KPA, and he actually expelled out the CVF, Chinese Voluntary Forces, in 1956 or 7, when the U.S. actually introduced a tactical nuclear weapon inside of South Korea. So in terms of the military point of view, this did not make sense why Kim Il-sung expelled the CVF in the late 1950, in the climax of the Cold War. Because Kim Il-sung really wanted to do independence, so he created Juche ideology, and he wanted to develop the nuclear weapons, not just against the U.S. imperialism, but at the same time in minimizing of Chinese influence of the North Korea. Today, Kim Jong-un want to minimize the dependency on China because of already more than 95% of total trade from China. So this is a monopoly market and then semi-colonized. So when China government suggests a kind of free railway from Sinŭiju to Kaesong, Kim Jong-un never thought about, never accepted this kind of Chinese free support because he also fear about Chinese influence over the North Korea. So Korean War legacy is still very influential of the Korean Peninsula security issue. And we have to understand this kind of several issues still relevant to Korean security. Even today, Kim Yo-jong is aggressive speech on kind of thing. So we have to understand the nature of Korean war. So another interesting is Kim Il-sung want to occupy South Korea, absolutely. But at the time, political rival Park Hun-hyung is number 2 of North Korea, really want to do invasion as early as possible, because his political power is in South Korea, not in North Korea. At the time, Kim Il-sung and his group is very small, and Park Hun-hyung group is most of majority in South Korea against the Seungman Lee government. So Park Hun-hyung really want to do fast, and because of unified Korea under the government, Park Hun-hyung could be number 1 rather than Kim Il-sung. So this kind of issue also inside the dynamics of North Korean politics in the 1950s. So early 1960, Kim Il-sung really became dictator. But before then, in the 1950 and late 1940, Kim Il-sung really want to do his dictatorship by purging his political rival, also making Kim Il-sung, I call kids, Kim Il-sung kids became a North Korean version of middle class living in Pyongyang, and got the opportunity to study in the Soviet Union, and got opportunity in a world mobile opportunity to become middle class of the North Korea. So Kim Il-sung using this kind of political strategy from already pre-war period. So we need to still understand the pre-Korean War and during the Korean War and post-Korean War, how it's still relevant to the Korean security issue today.
Great, that's super. I mean, a number of things that I think that stood out to me there. You know, first of all, you know, you've all mentioned in some way that there's a legacy of the Korean War that lasts today, and I turn to that in just a moment. I think Young-jun, your point about the internal dynamics and factionalism in North Korea, is a very specific instance of that. And when we're looking at how we can learn lessons from the Korean War for today, it is important to remember that North Korea is not monolithic. That even today under Kim Jong-un, who seemingly is sitting fairly firmly in the saddle, he has constituencies that he has to satisfy, and they don't always agree. And of course, he has to, as with all dictatorships, worry about his own position and his own safety. And then I think the third thing that sort of stands out is in some ways, the fact that that the Korean War isn't over yet. Technically it's still ongoing. And so, the legacy of the Korean War, isn't the legacy of a war that's, been completed and, time has passed and now we find ourselves in a different environment, at least here on the Korean Peninsula. Of course, the war is officially still ongoing. And I think I'll just, within that context, ask sort of two, very brief related questions. And then I think we'll move on after that to talk about maybe the contemporary situation a bit more. So in the interest of time, I'm going to link these two questions. So you can either take them as they are linked, or you can take one or both of them, or neither. And that would be, what critical failures occurred during the war? Were there any obvious blunders, tactical or strategic, or political, diplomatic? What missed opportunities might there have been for one side or the other, or both sides? So what critical failures might have taken place during the war? And then in a sort of related sense, why has the war not ended yet? Those two things may be connected, maybe not. So anyway, I'll sort of throw those two questions out on the table, and any of you three who want to answer it, please feel free to get started.
Well, let me start because the other two are real soldiers, and so they'll be able to do better military analysis. So I want to take the easy ones. The two, as far as the fighting of the war itself, the two that leap to mind for me would be ignored warning. I mean, intelligence warning. It's documented that Kim Il-sung was warned, including by Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, very specifically warned about the Incheon landing, which is what reversed the course of the war. When MacArthur pulled off that landing in September 1950, up until that point, Kim Il-sung, the North Koreans were having a tough time in August, but still they had done incredibly well, pushing down South Korean and U.S. forces all the way to the little thumbnail, the so-called Pusan perimeter. And we have to be careful about counterfactuals and hypotheticals, but it's safe to say that fundamentally reversed the course of the war against North Korea. And without the Incheon landing, it is hard to imagine exactly what would have happened. So Kim Il-sung really clearly missed that warning for various reasons. And then right up there with that is then General MacArthur, after this great landing in Incheon and moving forces up and now pushing North Koreans right up to the Yalu River. He ignored the warnings. While it was maybe a little less explicit, still it's pretty well documented, and I've looked over a lot of this stuff. There was an awareness that he should be worried about the Chinese entering, and there have been Chinese troop movements, and the CIA couldn't say when exactly, but there were plenty of alarm lights that had gone off, and MacArthur ignored them. He was very confident. He said, "We'll have the troops home by Christmas," and in fact, by that point, the Chinese had amassed a massive force, and then basically through the element of surprise, were able to push the Americans all the way back down. So those are the two big reversals in the course of the war, and they both come, I think you can say, from intelligence failures, which is always a place to learn lessons. Maybe I'll stop at that and circle back to your second question if necessary.
Sure.
Well, I feel, of course, I am speaking in my unofficial capacity, my civilian capacity, and these views are my own and don't represent those of the United States Air Force, the US government, or the Department of Defense. But since John mentioned they were intel failures, as an intel officer, I feel like I have to kind of speak up and say it's not so much, and those are two great examples. It wasn't so much in the US case of an intel failure. You can read, for example, on the CIA website, they have declassified reports saying of even interrogation of Chinese soldiers in Korea. The problem wasn't that they didn't have the intelligence. The problem was bias, the inability to actually accept the information that they were receiving. And I always find this so fascinating because these interrogations, you'll see the CIA writing like, wow, this is such a deceptive campaign that the Koreans have even learned fluent Chinese and claim they're Chinese when we're interrogating them. Like they couldn't see that there were Chinese soldiers in Korea, even when they'd captured them and they were right in front of them. And so this type of bias, I still think really colors a lot of assumptions on at least US policy when it comes to the Korean Peninsula. For example, I've done in-depth research on China's policy vis-a-vis North Korea. And it's no secret in Beijing that China does not like North Korea. The Chinese military's plans of getting involved in a second sort of Korean war involve fighting the North Koreans to get on the Korean Peninsula, not so much defending the North Koreans. But no matter how much information I provide, the viewpoint in Washington is, these two sides love each other, they're best friends, and the Chinese will fight to the death for the North Koreans. And so a lot of times you have the information there, people just refuse to see it. And this, in many cases, goes to Mason's other question about why this war hasn't ended. I think, unfortunately, the reasons just change with the times, right? Originally, it took 18 months to negotiate just that ceasefire for various reasons, but one of the big ones being a prisoner of war situation that had to do with geopolitics, in which there were some Chinese prisoners of war that wanted to be returned to Taiwan because they were nationalists and they knew if they were returned back to mainland China, they would be killed. And I think there was a somewhat of a period of exhaustion after 18 months of negotiation. It's like, okay, we got our ceasefire, let's leave it at that. And then throughout time, the reasons why you didn't want to negotiate more, I think both the North Koreans and the South Koreans, wanted reunification. And so negotiating the end of the war might be admitting to the bifurcation of the country forever, kind of admitting defeat. And then in more contemporary times, there's this idea that North Korea had violated the armistice by use of force in a number of instances, like in the Chonan incident when they sunk the Chonan. So then it's like, we can't have a peace agreement if they're not even adhering to the armistice. And you go this, further, and you talk about the many different players in the war. One of the complications of having so many external actors is all these actors have to agree, right? So now you have to have China, for example, agree to a peace settlement. You have to have South Korea agree, North Korea agree, the United States, United Nations. And there's a lot of implications for the U.S.-South Korean alliance and the presence of U.S. military personnel in South Korea if the war no longer happens. And so there's a view, and I think rightly so, that China would like to see an official end to the war because it will delegitimize the U.S. military presence so close to them. And this is, one of the reasons the United States doesn't want to end the war. And given also that the threat of North Korea has not dissipated, if anything, in recent years it's increased with the nuclearization of North Korea, et cetera, it seems like it would be kind of a nonsensical move to say, okay, now the war is over as the threats of violence and use of force have increased over time. So I think there's many different reasons, unfortunately, throughout history. Those reasons have changed over time, but now we're at the point where it becomes very difficult given North Korea's behavior, given China's geopolitical interests, and the challenges for South Korea and for the United States to come together and finally sign a peace deal.
Super. Young-jun.
The major failure is the Korean is rather than during the war, but pre-war is more problem. I think is because of already when Stalin gave a positive sign to Kim Il-sung on invasion of South, January of 1950, he already had a negotiation with Mao over the Manchuria, about the formal negotiation between the Chiang Kai-shek and Stalin about the Soviet right over the Manchuria. So he gave up his right from the Zhangjia's negotiation, and he gave a positive sign to Kim Il-sung January of 1950, because well, you already know Stalin rejected Kim Il-sung's ideal over the 1.5 years. Every time Kim Il-sung want to get approval of Stalin on invasion of South. But Stalin already manipulated the war from the January of the 1950. And then, interesting enough, the Chinese historian Cheng Jian at Columbia University, former, and now NYU University professor, found the Chinese sources. Mao already ready for the war. At the time, the June 25th of the 1950, he has 320,000 Chinese soldiers over the Yalu River, and he want to intervene before the UN forces arrival of Busan. But Stalin never approved, because he already want to fight between the China and the US during the Korean War for maximizing of the European interests, the East European alliance. So already Stalin manipulate this kind of war when he approved the January of 1950, and he gave Kim Il-sung, you need admission of the Mao. When the U.S. forces intervene in the Korean War, you have to get approval Chinese forces intervention. So this kind of manipulation already started early 1950. So for preventing this kind of nightmare, I think as the U.S. military administration, when they came to the 1945, General Hachi, U.S. military administration, have to more understand the South Korean political situation, not just believing Seungman Lee administration kind of a semi-dictatorship. In the he already hired 95% of a former Japanese collaborationist police officer and judge, the other thing, and he didn't land the reform enough. But U.S. Military administration at the time only want to think about the anti-communism regime, Seungman Lee, for his interests. So this kind of South Korean political nightmare became the bigger political chaos situation in both Korea. So I think as the major problem is already start in the 1945 when the U.S. forces arrive South Korea, and Oriana already say lack of understanding South Korean situation post Japanese colonial period was a major problem, was a major issue post Korean interest in. This is one is a land reform. Second is pro-Japanese collaboration is the problem. So because of the failure of solving this problem, the getting mess inside North Korea politics, and then Kim Il-sung got his side in North Korea, sponsored by Soviet Union, and Seungman Lee and his colleague, former pro-Japanese collaborationist, got the political power and purged the other former independent figure like Kim Gu or Yeon-young, the other guy. So this is a fundamental problem, not just during the Korean period, but before Korean already have a lot of problems started. So I think it's yeah, John. Yeah, my point is this is a fundamental problem already start before the Korean War.
Great. Thanks to both of you. Sorry, thanks to all three of you. Does anybody have anything they want to say to?
Well, I did want to just jump in on the discussion about the armistice and some good points made. Is that all right, Mason, if I supplement a little? Because this is also something that intrigues me a lot. I thought a lot about, especially with all the discussion here on the end of war declaration, which probably most people would take the time to watch this video, know what we're talking about, which had been an element that was never materialized in the U.S., North Korea, South Korea peace diplomacy of 2018. And there's been massive amount of discussion of the end of war declaration and what it would mean here in South Korea. And, trying to step back from that discussion a little bit in light of what we're seeing the last couple of days and what we can expect going forward, I think that the situation is quite interesting because an armistice situation lasting this long, Oriana, you can tell me comparatively, is fairly rare in history to have this long of an armistice since 1953. And it's worth thinking, and it's complicated over time, historical time, why the armistice has basically held together for all the violations actually on both sides that are continuing occurring at a relatively low level, some a bigger level. Basically, the armistice regime, as it's called, has held. And one way I think we can think about it is neither the concerned parties, which the primary parties would be the two Koreas, but then as we're talking about, China and Russia and the United States and at another tier, Japan, are always there in the mix. The parties have never really wanted to make the transformation of an armistice regime to a peace regime. That it sounds nice, dovish and sweet, oh, peace. But it would be highly destabilizing. Oriana pointed to some of the reasons why, from a U.S. national security perspective, actually a peace regime is quite threatening. China also has its reasons for finding a real peace, a transformation to a peace regime threatening, because that could just as easily take a form of North and South Korea getting along under a kind of U.S. umbrella and North Korea moving away, as I completely agree with Young-jun about both the historical, from Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, right down to Kim Jong-un, there are profound tensions, and Oriana knows this as well. Deep, more than tensions, deep distrust in the North Korea-China relationship. And North Korea is perpetually looking for the opportunity to, exploit that by moving closer to the United States. That's one of the things we were seeing in 2018. And so in that sense, that would come in the form of peace and would be highly destabilizing and unnerving to the Chinese. That's why when this notion of, end of war might happen, when that came out, the strongest statement against it was from the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who said, wait a second, are you talking about ending the Korean War without us? You can't end the Korean War without China, if they stopped and listened to what they were saying. On the other hand, they're always calling for the end of the Korean War. And yet when they saw this configuration where the three parties were getting along and were going to do without them, they immediately responded very negatively to that. So, but it's never been there. We lost that momentum for reasons we can discuss and might even disagree on, but we can agree we lost that momentum. It didn't materialize. And it's that configuration has never come together, where the two Koreas, with enough support of the region, the great powers, really want to transform the relationship from armistice, which keeps them apart. And frankly, South Korea wants it as well. It keeps North Korea away. And from a North Korean perspective, it keeps South Korea away. And as much as everyone says they don't like it, actually they're comfortable with that. And so there's never been a point where the elites and the public are really ready to get rid of that wall. At the same time, I'll finish here. At the same time, they don't want war. If they want a war, there would have been another Korean War. So they don't really want war. They don't really want peace. And so this armistice, which is by definition temporary, has gone on and on and on.
Well, if I can just jump in there and maybe use this as an opportunity in the limited amount of time that we have left, to bring up at least a few small points that go to some of the things that John just mentioned. One of the reasons why the armistice is held has obviously been the presence of the United Nations here, and certainly the United States current attitude towards international organizations, including the UN, isn't a particularly healthy one. So I'm not sure what that portends for the future. Secondly, I think a sort of standard and I think largely correct response is that one of the things that's helped the armistice to hold is the U.S.-South Korea alliance. Presumably, without that, there are numerous points in the past where we might have seen lower levels of conflict escalate without the U.S. South Korea alliance continuing to exist and to be strong. And I guess that sort of then leads me to, I guess, my third point, which is, because of the sort of naturally unstable nature of this type of armistice, and as John pointed out, I guess historically, these types of solutions to conflict, to major war, tend not to last as long as this one has. There is frequently the possibility that indeed conflict could escalate, and that full-blown hot war could start again. So I'm going to direct a question to Oriana, and then also throw out a general question to all of the three of you. If conflict were to break out in a significant way on the Korean Peninsula again, under what conditions would China intervene on the peninsula? And then the second question, the more general one, should the United States still be stationed here with troops on the Korean Peninsula, or should it not be the case that perhaps there should be a drawdown of that, in part perhaps because something needs to come unstuck in order for the armistice to move beyond the present stage that it's in now? Would that provide an impetus, towards peace, or would that simply be an invitation to conflict breaking out, which no one wants?
Well, those are both very easy questions to answer, Mason, so I can get to it very quickly.
I'm sorry.
So China intervening on the Korean Peninsula, the first thing, if anyone can take away anything about this, is the fact that as China has risen and their military has modernized, a lot of their viewpoints on when and the conditions under which they would use military force have changed. So some of our listeners might have heard things like China's main concern is about refugees along the border, that maybe this would be kind of the main impetus for how they would use military force in this scenario. This is no longer the case. Yes, like in the 1990s, when China, had a navy that couldn't sail beyond the coast, and they couldn't have aircraft that fly at night or over water. Like, their main concern was like, how are we going to deal with refugees crossing the border? But now they have a whole plan for that. And actually Chinese writings talks very extensively about how the People's Armed Police would deal with that, and how that mission is now, in the hands of basically law enforcement. And they have 120,000 troops stationed along the Korean Peninsula. And the way that they exercise, and if you look at the equipment they have, it is designed to intervene extensively into Korean territory. It is not just set up a buffer zone on the border type of situation. We can see from their exercises, their reorganization, from the weapons that they have, that they are planning on intervening extensively. And when would they do that? Of course, it's not just when there's North Korean provocation. It is when it looks like North Korea is not going to survive. Now, that non-survival is not that China will intervene to prop up North Korea necessarily. It is that China wants to hold territory. So just like in the Korean War, they have a seat at the table to negotiate what the future of the Korean Peninsula will look like. And Xi Jinping himself has said that he would accept a reunified Korea under South Korean control if that new Korea was not, and John alluded to this, not under the influence and not close to the United States, right? The main thing for China is not the need to keep North Korea. The main thing is, why should China risk a potential war, risk, costs of life and treasure to just increase U.S. power and influence on the peninsula? So I am convinced after extensive research on this topic that if China felt like a reunified Korea would be closer to China and farther from the United States, it would be much more helpful in pressuring North Korea, because they wouldn't really care whether or not that regime survived. And so Chinese intervention is really going to be contingent on, do they think that it's possible that the regime is not going to survive? So do they need to control territory to prevent nuclear use? Also, that's a whole part of their strategy, is to gain control of North Korean nuclear sites to prevent nuclear use, but then have a role in the negotiation. And just a brief comment about the U.S. position on the Korean Peninsula. I mean, the bottom line is, as long as there's a threat from North Korea and the South Koreans want the United States there, the United States will stay. It is the position of the United States that we don't negotiate over the security of our allies and partners with third parties. So unless the South Koreans, I mean, I guess President Trump kind of throws a lot of these norms up in the air, but that's always how we've kind of seen it, right? If the South Koreans say that they want us there, there's still the threat will be there. Now, I have talked to a lot of U.S. military personnel who have said, even in a reunified situation, we should stay, we should want to stay. And I disagree with that. I think once the rationale is gone, as long as, of course, the South Koreans feel comfortable with us going, there's no operational benefit. Even if we're thinking about contingencies with China, there's no benefit for our forces to be there. We can't use them because they're too close to China. They're too much in the threat ring and they present a threat to China. So the purpose of the U.S. forces are to defend South Korea against North Korea if that threat went away. My hope is that the United States could take those resources and those forces and focus them elsewhere in the region where there's greater need for peace and stability. But that would, of course, have to come at the request and with the full support of South Korea.
Great, very comprehensive answer. Thanks for that. John, Young-jun?
Well, let's see. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the first question, Chinese intervention, I would mostly agree with Oriana. There are plenty of scenarios I can imagine where China would feel justified and necessary intervening. I mean, let's not forget, they are defense treaty allies with DPRK in good standing. It drives me nuts when I read stuff saying like, oh, the treaty doesn't exist anymore. Until one party gives the word, the treaty is there, and we tend to ignore it, but it provides a legal basis, which would be quite meaningful, and we would be hearing a lot about it from China in the case of some of these various contingencies you'd imagine, where they say they are treaty bound to come to the defense of North Korea. That's in any kind of scenario where it's not 100% clear that North Korea actually started it, and those kinds of scenarios are easily imaginable.
Can I just jump in real quick and say, isn't the treaty up next year for renewal? So
it automatically renews. It was signed in July of 1961, and it automatically renews
20 years,
every
right?
20 years. Yeah. So like Kim Jong-un or Xi Jinping would have to be giving the announcement really soon to say we don't want to renew it.
Okay.
And the other thing is, I mean, right now, to link it to current events, as far as what we can expect, everyone's, putting their seatbelts on as they should be. And one of the places where things can easily get out of hand and have gotten out of hand between the two Koreas is in their disputed maritime area in the West Sea or the Yellow Sea. And, there's a heavy Chinese presence there. There's tons of Chinese fishermen. Some of our friends were just on the boat out there from the NK News crew and talked about how many Chinese fishermen they saw. And so China has plenty of assets that could be quickly, there could be Chinese casualties in some inter-Korean altercation, of which there have been many over the years. This is something that could be happening by the end of this week. And I can see, again, for the reasons Oriana described, that China's capabilities are evolving so quickly, and improving every year. And also we've seen under Xi Jinping, it is ultimately a more, whatever you want to call it, assertive, aggressive, forward-leaning China. I can imagine them responding differently. Typically they have passive responses. I could see an active military response where Chinese ships suddenly move in and say, you know what, we lost one of our fishing vessels and we have interests here, and we go from there. And how would the United States respond? So I can imagine a lot of those scenarios, and scenarios we're not as used to because China's behavior is changing along with their capabilities. Quickly on USFK, I mean, I would defer to Oriana and other military analysts in terms of what is the actual kind of military, strategic, and tactical value of all the assets that are here. Not just the 30,000, give or take, people, but you could look at something like THAAD, which is the most in the news, newer U.S. asset, and debate pros or cons of having it here. The question of what is required, how much, if anything, of a U.S. military presence is required in South Korea, I think it does boil down to what's the purpose? If the purpose is solely to deter North Korea from invading again, if they're there with the original mandate, which is basically don't let, June 25th, 1950 occur again, I'm pretty skeptical. I mean, I think if Trump sent a tweet and said, Yankees are coming home, trying to gin up something for November, and they actually left, I do not think North Korea would invade South Korea. And people's hair would be on fire expecting that. And that would be low on my list of things to worry about. South Korea is a very strong military power. Maybe Young-jun wants to speak of it. And in the transition of getting rid of USFK would then acquire all kinds of capabilities that it hasn't had because USFK has always been here, has the resources to pay for that kind of stuff. So I think it does get into the bigger picture of China and more generally in the region. How much is this alliance that is kind of reified by a troop presence? How important is that piece in the whole architecture? And if you pull that piece out, I don't think North Korea suddenly invades or even in the near term invades, but it affects the architecture, and what else is happening? Are US troops also leaving Japan? If they leave Korea, what is the implications of their status in Japan? So again, peace is destabilizing, and it would raise all kinds of complicated questions, but these may be the kinds of questions that we all have to grapple with, because there's a tendency to fall back on the post-1945 liberal world order. You look at what's happening in the United States, and the country's kind of falling apart. And it's very unclear where that process is going. And it's going to have profound implications. It already has profound implications for the world order. So we probably need to think in more destabilizing scenarios that we haven't liked to think about, just because the status quo is not going to work like it used to.
John, I just want to say thanks for saying that these are some tough questions that we should grapple with, because I feel like my friends here in the USFK and my friends back in Washington are all going to have a heart attack when they see this, and they see that I actually brought up the possibility of drawing down troops from the peninsula. So the fact that you've legitimated that makes me feel somewhat insulated from criticism. I'm gonna just ask one.
Happy to legitimate you, Mason.
Thank you so much. I'm just gonna ask one last very small question, then we got to let everybody go. And so just a very short answer from each of you. We're 70 years on from the beginning of the Korean War. We're 20 years on from the June 15 joint declaration. Things don't seem like they're getting any better here, all things considered. And I believe it was Nietzsche who said on the uses and abuses of history that it's only with forgetting that we can actually finally live. And so I'll just push back against that Nietzschean remark just a little bit and say, what's the one thing that we should remember from the lead up to the Korean War, or during the Korean War, or the aftermath of the Korean War, that's a sort of lesson for us today? Like, what's the one lesson that we can draw from this tragic history? I'll start with Oriana.
Well, since you mentioned it, of sort of the U.S. position on international institutions currently, the only reason the United States so quickly was able to put together a UN coalition to fight in the Korean War is because the Soviet Union, because they were upset, they didn't show up to vote. Right? So I would say one big lesson in the overall competition with China that the United States has not learned with the Trump administration, hopefully we learn in the future, is just because you're frustrated with how international institutions are not doing what you want them to do, doesn't mean that you give up on them. It means that you become more active, more engaged, and you engage in even more institution building. It's not a surprise to me that institutions built almost around the time of the Korean War 70 years ago can't address all the issues of today. So if that move of the Soviet Union doesn't teach the United States that it's not a great strategy not to show up, I'm not sure what will.
From your lips to God's ears, I completely agree with you. John?
Ooh, tough to follow that. That's a brilliant point. And so I would just strongly reaffirm what Oriana said. Actually, I'd make a small correction too, Mason, now that I've legitimated you. You said the United Nations are here. The United Nations are not here, except for the flag. The United Nations Command which is most definitely not the UN, but traces back its mandate, a legal authority, but is a multinational force under US military leadership, is here. And actually that could be the kind of clue to what Oriana is talking about in a very different, hopefully imminent future America, of thinking about, wow, what would it mean if instead of using the fig leaf of the UN command, the United Nations got seriously involved, you know, or other international institutions and structures got involved in fundamentally transforming dynamics on the Korean Peninsula toward peace? What would that mean? You know, so yeah, I mean, to try and add some, that's just to supplement Oriana, to try and add my own, what should be remembered. I think that the issue, I always talk with my students about agency, you know, that history, the study of history is a study of agency. Who's the actor? Who's driving events, or what is driving events? Because sometimes it's not a human actor, it's environmental factors, economic factors, all the technological factors. And so that's what makes history fun and hard, is defining agency. And you can even explain the exact same phenomenon at different levels, choosing a different agent. So I think, again, given where we seem to be headed in the current context, it's very important to think about the agency of the two Koreas, you know, as a divided soul. And I'm relied upon for hopeful interpretations, even of the worst events. And so my Panglossian gloss on what's happening now is that, you know, why is Kim Jong-un blowing up empty buildings? Just like he closed Kumgangsan, you know, and said this was the mistake. Interestingly said, like, basically dad made a mistake. Nietzsche also said the old temple has to be destroyed before the new one can be built. And so if we try to radically reimagine inter-Korean relations, you know, not having another event celebrating the June 15, 2000 summit, but really fundamentally transforming the relationship in a way where both sides can imagine moving beyond armistice, you know, are not so threatened by the existence of the other, then that's how we can, I think, break out of this long sense of being stuck in a historical era. And that would be my, and so, you know, for the United States, and I guess for China, for enlightened observers in China for that matter, the role is secondary. How can we support that? You know, what supplemental role can we play? Which is not how great powers tend to like to think. But if the two Koreas got that agency between themselves, they'd be a little bit hard to stop. I mean, if the two Koreas could really agree on something, they could get somewhere. Great, thanks, John. I really appreciate it. Young-jun, you get the final word.
Yes. Maybe we know the sentence, the freedom is not free. I think it's a peace is not free, because we already spent a lot of the sacrifice and innocent victim, even recently, some years ago, Yeonpyeong attack or Cheonan incident. So we tried our best to make the peace with the sponsor of four major superpower, Russia, China, the US, and Japan. But it's not easy. We still see today, 7 years Korean anniversary, we still have a lot of the fighting between each other. And North Korea has a nuclear weapons, and the US and China has a struggle, and the rise of the Chinese military is a bigger problem, I think, than the North Korea for the long term. So we have a very difficult time, but we have to remember this is about the human being story, not just about the Cold War rhetoric dominated the Korean War story. Because I searched the North Korean archives is about the personal history. For example, young soldier of the Korean People's Army. Everybody saw them as an ideological robot, brainwashed by Kim Il-sung, but they are not. They have their own dream at the time, because if they are just 16 years old, the 17 years old girl who study in the Soviet Union, who want to be a dancer, kind of. So we need to think about this is a human being history. We need to think about this is ordinary people's, so how much they spend their life for unnecessary war. So we tried our best to make the peace. And Korean people sometimes say about no one country want unified Korea. For example, the China or Russia or Japan doesn't want to unify strong Korea because of they want divided Korea because of for their own interests. So I hope that this is long, but this is a not easy issue, especially at the U.S.-China struggle time for the long term. So we try our best, and we still remember, we have to remember this is a human being story, and the peace is not free. So we try our best, and with the sponsor of our friend country. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much to each of you. Those were all some wonderful observations at the end, and obviously tremendously deep insights throughout the conversation today. Once again, on behalf of the Asia Society, I want to thank Oriana Skylar Mastro from Georgetown and soon Stanford, John Delury from Yonsei University, and Kim Young-jun from the Korea National Defense University for joining us today to provide their insights on the Korean War at 70, looking back to look forward. Thanks a lot, and we hope that we'll see you again for another Asia Society Korea Roundtable. Thanks again.